Welcome to the House of Hypertrophy. Is it true that lifting weights is a waste of time for maximizing muscle growth, and that instead static holds in the contracted position followed by slowly lowering the weight is the secret? No doubt it's a bold claim, and it's one made by Mike Mentzer as well as indirectly by Arthur Jones, who was the founder of the HIIT training system. Mentzer states,
I have come to discover that lifting weights is a waste of time. The positive portion of any exercise, the lifting of the weight, is the least productive in terms of stimulating an increase.
Arthur Jones states,
the negative part of work, Steve, is by far the most productive and the most important part of exercise. And when you leave the negative work out of exercise, you have little or nothing of benefit left.
You may be wondering how on earth you would use this information to help your training. There are a few ways. Mike Mentzer describes his approach.
With my clients, I have been putting a heavier weight than normal on the leg extension machine, a weight considerably heavier than they can handle for 6 to 10 reps to failure. I help them into the straight leg contracted position, and they hold it there for as long as they can, literally, and then I emphasize, now start to lower it very slowly under control. Reset psychologically, and let's do one more.
Besides leg extensions, leg curls, lat pull-downs, pull-ups, chin-ups, lateral raises, and biceps curls are exercises where this method can be done. This method may sometimes require a partner to assist you with lifting the load into the static hold position. But if we forget about performing the static hold altogether, there are some creative ways you can challenge yourself more in the lowering part of an exercise without a partner. Before quickly describing these, some of you may be wondering about just slowing down the lowering part of normal training. The thing is, your muscles are approximately 40% stronger during the lowering phase. So although slowing down the lowering part of normal training provides a greater challenge throughout the lowering, you're still going to be held back by your lifting strength, so it's not quite optimally challenging the lowering part. Even so, we will discuss if you should slow down the lowering part with normal training later on in this video. Nonetheless, here are the methods that more effectively challenge the lowering part. Starting with lowering only, many people are not strong enough to perform the lifting part of Nordic curls and reverse Nordic curls, so just training the lowering part is highly challenging. The same applies to pull-ups and chin-ups. If you're not strong enough to lift yourself up yet, just training the lowering of the movement can be challenging. You can even use weighted pull-ups or chin-ups with a load you're not strong enough to lift, so that you're just challenging yourself on the lowering portion. We also have the 2-1 method, where you lift the load with 2 limbs, but then switch to lowering with only 1 limb, thereby providing a greater challenge in the lowering part for that limb. This can be done with a range of exercises: leg extensions, leg curls, seated rows, chest presses, landmine rows, and landmine presses. Finally, there's the more risky cheat method, where you use momentum and cheat to lift the load, and then you control the lowering portion. There are also special machines that provide a greater challenge in the lowering part, such as flywheel devices, but I'm assuming the majority of people don't have access to this. But the information in this video certainly applies to these special machines too. So, should you be implementing any of these methods into your program? Can it unlock a new level of gains and elevate your physique to new heights? Well, both Mentzer and Jones provide their anecdotes.
I had one client start up with me 3.5 months ago. He couldn't do the whole stack on the leg extension for even 1 rep, but after 2 months he was up to the whole stack for 14 reps. Then he hit a sticking point. He couldn't go beyond 14 reps for 3 workouts. This was when I started working with the idea of static contracted holds and lowerings. For 2 or 3 workouts in a row, all he did was hold a very heavy weight in the straight leg position and lowered it, doing it 2 times in that fashion as I described. The next workout we went back to see if there was a carryover to the positive strength, and his leg extensions went up to 20 reps. That's a phenomenal improvement.
Mentzer goes on to say,
and I'm not exaggerating when I say that this is literally one of the most stunning discoveries in recent bodybuilding science.
Arthur Jones states,
we did an experiment at the military academy at West Point in 1975. The Bengals, a professional football team from Cincinnati, had hired a football player. They'd signed him up to a contract. They'd given him an $80,000 bonus. The man weighed 286 pounds, and one of his tests in order to be accepted was he had to chin himself a certain number of times. Do a pull-up on a bar. This man couldn't begin to chin himself. 12 days prior to his reporting for the training camp, they sent him to us in desperation and said, make this man capable of chinning himself. Otherwise, we're going to blow our 80,000. We've given him the 80,000. He spent it. It's gone. If he can't chin himself, we're going to have to drop him. So do something, please. You got 12 days to do it. Well, you know, we take him to a chinning bar. He reaches up, he grabs a hold of the bar, he tries to pull, and nothing happens. So what do? Well, you can't train him in a positive manner. He's incapable of pulling himself up. So we put him on a bench in the top position. And then we removed the bench and told him to lower himself. The first time we did it, he went zap to the floor. He just about yanked his arms out by the roots. He couldn't even do a negative chin. He couldn't lower himself. So we held him up. We stood under him, held him by the buttocks, and gave him assistance so that he could do part of the negative work. 12 days later, he was tested. He did 4 3/4 chins in a normal fashion, pulling himself up and lowering himself down, pulling himself back up. He didn't quite get 5, but that was more than enough to pass his test.
Although these anecdotes from Mentzer and Jones are highly fascinating, by no means do they sincerely prove the superiority of the methodology. These are just 2 individual anecdotes. No comparisons with other training were made, and muscle growth wasn't measured. Fortunately, the scientific research has come a long way since Mentzer and Jones made these statements, and the literature can shed light onto whether Mentzer and Jones were onto something. Sit back and relax as we dissect the science on this fascinating topic. We'll get to the bottom of how muscle growth compares between the lifting and lowering portions, if any of the methods outlined are superior, and we will also learn about some underrated facts about how muscles generate force and adapt to training. Before deconstructing how growth may compare between the lifting and lowering portions, I would like to dissect the first part of Mentzer's recommendation specifically, which involves a static hold at the most contracted position. In other words, an isometric at the contracted position. Mentzer believed this to be powerful.
Obviously, the only place that you can achieve a maximum contraction would be in the fully contracted position. That is the only position of the exercise where 100% of the muscular bulk can be activated.
We have research verifying that static holds near the contracted position indeed stimulate hypertrophy. However, there is nothing superior about this. In fact, the same research finds that holding static contractions at more lengthened muscle positions generates more muscle hypertrophy. The research on partial range of motions further supports this notion. That is, partial range of motions at lengthened muscle positions tend to build more muscle than partial range of motions at contracted positions. For example, this 2014 paper compared leg extensions with a partial at lengthened positions to contracted positions, and vastus lateralis growth was better with the lengthened partials. Another 2021 Japanese paper compared preacher curls with a partial at lengthened positions to contracted positions, and combined biceps and brachialis growth was better with the lengthened partials. In fact, regular viewers of the House of Hypertrophy will know that emerging research, specifically 3 studies, have found that a partial range of motion at lengthened muscle positions built more muscle overall compared to a full range of motion. More research is required to verify if partials at lengthened positions are always more superior to a full range of motion. Regardless, all of this data would indicate that although static holds at the contracted position do evoke muscle hypertrophy, there's nothing special about it. Why could this be? After all, Mentzer said the contracted position was the only position of the exercise where 100% of the muscle bulk can be activated. Well, Mentzer wasn't quite correct. When the muscle is fully contracted and you're squeezing it, you shouldn't confuse the feeling as an indicator of the actual forces being generated by the muscle fibers. Muscles generate force thanks to their sarcomeres, which are the force-generating units of muscles. Here's how a sarcomere looks. Force is generated when things called the myosin heads extend from the myosin filament and pull on the actin filament towards the M-line. These forces are transmitted to the tendon, causing the muscle to pull on the bone. When the muscle is shortened fully, sometimes the sarcomeres can be excessively shortened, to the point where many myosin heads cannot extend and attach to the actin filaments to generate force. Another factor we need to consider is your central nervous system, that's the CNS. which is your brain and spinal cord. Remember, muscles produce force in the first place thanks to the electrical signals they receive from the CNS. It may come as a surprise to some, but most people's CNS cannot fully access 100% of a muscle's force-producing potential. There is some degree of deficit. For example, this study found subjects could only access 84.5% of the quadriceps maximum force-producing potential, whereas it was 95% for their elbow flexors and calves. These are called your voluntary activation levels. Quite interestingly, a couple of studies indicate voluntary activation may be higher at more lengthened positions. In other words, your CNS has an easier time accessing the force-producing potential of your muscle fibers at lengthened positions. A final factor we need to consider is passive forces. Besides the myosin and actin interactions that generate force, your muscles have structures that can generate force when they are stretched, such as titin, which is within the sarcomere itself. This is a passive force, and rubber bands can help you conceptualize this. When you stretch a rubber band, it produces passive force to resist the stretch, and when you let go of it, that passive force snaps it back into its original shape. Titin operates in the same way, generating passive forces when stretched. All these three reasons tell us why the most contracted position isn't necessarily the position where the muscle produces the most force, or where 100% of the muscle bulk is activated. Now, although all this research outlined indicates that static holds in the most contracted position aren't special, this doesn't discount Mentzer's method yet, because remember, the static hold is just one part. The second part is controlling the lowering parts of the movement. This raises the question, are Mentzer and Jones correct? Is the lowering part the most productive, with lifting being a waste of time and providing little benefit? A paper from Japan provides a fascinating insight into how growth may compare between the lifting and lowering of an exercise. 53 previously untrained individuals were assigned to a lifting only, lowering only, normal group, or control group. The control group did nothing and expectedly made no gains, so we'll ignore them. All the other groups trained the preacher curl with a partial range of motion at the lengthened position, 2 times per week for 5 weeks. The lifting only group just performed the lifting motion, with an investigator placing the weight back to the start. The lowering only group just performed the lowering motion, with an investigator placing the weight back at the top. A normal group performed both the lifting and lowering portions as you normally would. All 3 groups performed 3 sets of 10 repetitions with the same dumbbell load. The dumbbell load was progressed from 30 to 100% of their maximum isometric strength. It was found elbow flexor growth, consisting of the biceps and brachialis, increased the most in the normal and lowering only groups, with minimal gains seen from the lifting group. At face value, these results indicate the lowering part of the exercises are overwhelmingly responsible for the growth seen from normal training, with lifting adding very little. This exactly supports what Arthur Jones stated.
When you leave the negative work out of exercise, you have little or nothing of benefit left.
However, there is a potentially crucial limitation. In the Japanese paper, we don't know how close to failure subjects got. All we know is the groups used the same dumbbell load which was progressed throughout the study. But based on the numbers, I speculate it's quite likely the subjects were training quite far from failure for a fair chunk of the study. Why does this matter? With the lifting phase of an exercise, taking reps in close proximity to failure ensures we achieve high muscle fiber recruitment and forces in this portion, which is essential for optimizing the stimulus for growth. You probably don't have to go all the way to failure. Getting 3 to 2 reps away from failure could suffice. We have a range of studies that have had subjects train harder with lifting only repetitions, and much better hypertrophy is achieved. In these studies, special machines were largely used that unloaded the lowering phase, so that only the lifting was resisted. Based on this data, if we return to the paper from Japan, it's likely if subjects went sufficiently close to failure, we'd see lifting only to produce better hypertrophy. Moreover, perhaps the normal group, thanks to the addition of the lifting phase getting closer to failure, would see even better growth, surpassing the lowering only group. Accordingly, I'd speculate normal training is probably superior to lowering only. However, we've just been talking about lowering only training with the same load that you'd use with normal training. As alluded to near the start of the video, when muscles are producing force during the lowering of an exercise, you're a lot stronger, approximately 40% stronger. Before going any further, an interesting question is why are muscles stronger while lengthening? Titin might be the answer. Recall titin is a structure found within the sarcomeres, providing passive tension when the sarcomere stretches. There's speculation that when your muscles generate force while lengthening, titin alters its structure such that it can generate even greater passive forces. Therefore, the combination of these greater passive forces from titin with the forces generated from myosin and actin attachments may be the main reason why muscles are stronger while lengthening. During muscle shortening when lifting, it's only the myosin and actin attachments that are really contributing to force production. Near the start of the video, we also mentioned a range of methods you can use to more optimally challenge the lowering part of exercises. I would describe these as overloaded lowering training. The key with these is you're lowering a weight under control that you can't lift, or at least would struggle to lift. With the 2-1 method, though you're lifting the load with both limbs, you're then switching to only one limb to perform the lowering, and presumably, this one limb would struggle to lift the load. With some exercises like Nordic curls, reverse Nordic curls, pull-ups, and chin-ups, assuming you're not strong enough to perform the lifting part yet, just performing controlled lowering reps means you're overloading this part. As for Mentzer's method, I would actually say this is pretty close to qualifying as lowering only overloaded training. Recall he had subjects use quite heavy loads in the first place. On top of this, a static hold at the contracted position is held until fatigue first. This would essentially pre-fatigue the muscle and make it very hard, if not impossible, to lift the weight further, thereby meaning the upcoming controlled lowering somewhat replicates the physiological conditions of overloaded lowering training. This raises the question, how effective are lowering only repetitions when they are overloaded beyond what can be lifted? Remember I showed you this graph demonstrating that training harder with lifting only can produce notable growth. All the studies also had other groups that were performing lowering only repetitions which were overloaded. Special machines were used to achieve this, and these machines unloaded the lifting part so that lowering only overloaded reps was performed. This did actually produce slightly more hypertrophy versus the lifting only training. As a result, all the methods we mentioned that overloaded the lowering portion, including Mentzer's method, are likely going to be quite effective for building muscle. But does this mean they're superior to normal training? Well, this data is just comparing lifting only to lowering only. Normal training isn't just lifting, it's lifting plus the underloaded lowering reps. And we know, as per the Japanese study, underloaded lowering reps still produce respectable hypertrophy. As a result, normal training might end up producing similar hypertrophy to lowering only overloaded reps. Indeed, this is exactly what this paper established. As far as I know, it seems to be the only paper comparing normal training to lowering only overloaded reps, albeit in untrained older individuals. Muscle growth was similar between both. Now, some of you might be quite surprised at this. You may be thinking, wait a second, considering how much muscle those underloaded lowering reps built in the Japanese paper, shouldn't normal training go beyond and surpass lowering only overloaded training? Or conversely, perhaps you've been thinking something entirely different this whole time. You're thinking, since Mentzer's method also involves a pre-fatiguing static hold at the contracted position, which we know can stimulate hypertrophy, shouldn't this make it superior to normal training? Well, I think both are probably incorrect. I think some kind of threshold to the amount of growth that can be generated from your reps exists, and it may be related to the interaction between stimulus and fatigue. This ultimately means the growth produced by normal training just ends up being similar to lowering only overloaded training and Mentzer's method. Research on accentuated lowering training leads me to speculate this. What is accentuated lowering training? We've just been discussing lowering only overloaded reps, with the machines in the studies resulting in no real lifting reps performed. But there are even special machines out there that can challenge you well during the lifting phase, and then increase the load to overload the lowering phase. This is accentuated lowering training. In fact, the 2-1 method may be considered a form of accentuated lowering training, since the lifting part is performed with 2 limbs. You would think that accentuated lowering training should undeniably be superior for building muscle, since we're challenging the muscle highly during both the lifting and lowering parts. But there have been 11 studies, to my knowledge, comparing how accentuated lowering training compares to normal training, and the majority of them find similar hypertrophy between both, perhaps because there's only so much that can be stimulated. Summarizing this section, the lowering part of normal training does seem to contribute respectably to muscle growth, but provided you're training near to failure, the lifting portion will still contribute to muscle growth. Lowering only overloaded training and accentuated lowering training can be effective for building muscle, but the overall evidence would suggest they're no more effective than normal training. So far, we've just been focusing on the overall magnitude of hypertrophy, but based on a couple of studies, some might suggest that despite the overall magnitude of muscle hypertrophy being comparable between normal training and overloaded lowering training, the type of muscle growth they produce is slightly different. This is actually a highly fascinating speculation. Let us explore it more. We have some research indicating that lifting only repetitions may preferentially grow the middle regions of a muscle more, while lowering only overloaded repetitions better grow the lower regions of a muscle. Furthermore, the type of growth experienced at the cellular level could differ between lifting only and lowering only overloaded training. We know sarcomeres are the force-generating units of muscles. One of the primary ways muscles increase in size is by adding more sarcomeres. Sarcomeres can be added on top of each other, which is called an increase in sarcomeres in parallel, or sarcomeres can be added next to each other, which is called an increase in sarcomeres in series. We have some research alluding to the idea that lifting only reps predominantly increases sarcomeres in parallel, while lowering only overloaded reps predominantly increases sarcomeres in series. As a result, methods that overload the lowering part may do well to grow the lower regions of a muscle and stimulate an increase in sarcomeres in series. As for normal training, remember it's lifting plus underloaded lowering reps, and likely thanks to the inclusion of these underloaded lowering reps, normal training has actually been documented to cause pretty impressive growth at lower regions of a muscle, as well as likely an increase in sarcomeres in series. This seems to be particularly true when using a full range of motion that achieves a lengthened muscle position, or even using a partial range of motion at lengthened muscle positions. Now, lowering only overloaded training may still produce slightly better lower region growth and increases in sarcomeres in series versus normal training, but I don't know if these are practically meaningful enough in the long term yet. Therefore, in the absence of other research, my current speculation is that if you're just performing normal training, you're probably not leaving much on the table. One of the justifications from Mentzer for ditching the lifting portion was that he thought it was excessively fatiguing and prolonged recovery.
The positive, or the lifting of the weight, is a negative in that it is the one portion of the exercise that makes the deepest inroad into recovery ability.
Mentzer wasn't correct. We now have solid data demonstrating that lowering only overloaded training causes a lot more damage, soreness, and strength reductions in the days after compared to lifting only training. We even have data indicating that combining both lifting and lowering only overloaded training, i.e. accentuated lowering, produced no more fatigue than lowering only overloaded training, indicating the addition of the lifting did not exacerbate fatigue, rather the overwhelming amount of fatigue was attributable to the lowering parts. This is something to be mindful of if you'd like to perform lowering only overloaded training. It's going to be quite fatiguing, at least initially, but your body does produce a range of adaptations that reduce the amount of fatigue you experience over time. These adaptations are called the repeated bout effect, and at the House of Hypertrophy, we've previously dissected this study, which found after a training session of 5 sets of 15 maximal lowering only overloaded reps, substantial fatigue, damage, and soreness was present for at least 5 days after the training. But as subjects kept training with these lowering only overloaded reps across 10 weeks, they experienced a lot less fatigue, damage, and soreness. In fact, by the 10th week, there was very little to no soreness, damage, and fatigue in the days after training. Therefore, if you are including lowering only overloaded training, your recovery from it should improve over time. Nonetheless, the main point of this section was to demonstrate that, contrary to Mentzer's thoughts at the time, the evidence certainly does not support the idea that lifting is more fatiguing than lowering. If you're searching for further guidance on programming to obtain your desired physique, it can be tricky and time-consuming. However, our high-quality partner, the Alpha Progression app, can help you generate an evidence-based training program that's 100% custom to your needs in less than 3 minutes. Simply specify the equipment you have, how often and how long you want to train for, and if you want to focus or neglect certain muscles. There are even advanced options to periodize your training and implement deloads. There are over a quadrillion input combinations on which your plan is based, and with the touch of a few buttons you can customize things further. Through analyzing your past performance, the app provides progressive overload recommendations during your workouts to help you continue making gains. The app automatically generates graphs that display your long-term progression, thereby saving you time from having to manually track your progression. The link in the comments and description gives you a 2-week free trial of all the premium features, and if you like it and decide to go beyond, the link gives you 20% off a subscription. I truly believe the app is awesome, and the reviews speak to this. Before wrapping up, I would like to discuss the role of tempo during normal training. How far should you lift and lower? This 2015 meta-analysis combined the results of all the studies up to that time and found that provided you were performing repetitions to or very close to failure, individual rep tempos between 0.5 and 8 seconds produced similar muscle hypertrophy. Note, these durations combine both the lifting and lowering phases. More recent research further supports the notion that both faster and slower rep speeds can be similarly effective for building muscle. It had subjects train the leg extension with reps to failure, with one leg using a 1-second lifting and 1-second lowering tempo, and the other leg using a 3-second lifting and 3-second lowering tempo. Here were the time under tension durations for each leg, and despite the differences, muscle growth was similar between both. As a result, provided you're performing your reps near enough to failure, you're free to train with whatever repetition speed you prefer. However, some people have suggested combining a faster lifting tempo with a slower lowering tempo could be the recipe for superior gains. What does the research say about this? 2 studies have indeed found that when using a 1-second lifting speed on the preacher curl, using a 4-second lowering speed tended to produce better biceps gains versus using a 1-second lowering speed. However, 3 other studies have more conflicting results. One paper out of Japan found that when using a 2-second lifting tempo on the back squat, thigh gains were similar between using a 2 and 4-second lowering tempo. Another paper from Brazil found when using a 1-second lifting tempo on the leg extension, rectus femoris and vastus lateralis growth were similar between using a 2 and 4-second lowering speed, but vastus medialis gains were greater for the 4-second lowering speed. Finally, a study out of the USA found that when using a 1-second lifting tempo on the leg extension, gains in anterior thigh at one region were similar between using a 1-second lowering and 2-second lowering tempo, but gains at another region of the anterior thigh were actually greater with the 1-second lowering tempo. All in all, it's clear the research fails to currently establish a unanimously superior lowering tempo, but it's also clear the speed you lower with isn't the make or break for your training program. You're going to make gains either way, so I'd recommend using whatever lowering tempo you prefer. Mentzer and Jones were partly correct in that the lowering part of normal training contributes respectively to muscle growth, but their claims that the lifting part was a waste of time and provided little or no benefit isn't true. Provided you're training near to failure, the lifting portion will still contribute to muscle growth. Your muscles are approximately 40% stronger during the lowering, and methods that get you to challenge yourself more during the lowering part can be effective for building muscle, including Mentzer's method, but the overall evidence would imply they're no more effective than normal training. This should not be mistaken for me saying no one should ever perform these methods. If it's something you'd like to try, and you can do it safely with any of the methods outlined, then that's perfectly fine. Bear in mind that contrary to Mentzer's claims, overloaded lowering training can be quite damaging and fatiguing, at least initially, but your body does produce adaptations over time that decrease damage, so this isn't necessarily an issue. Thank you for watching. Feel free to check out the Alpha Progression app or our recent video that dissects a fascinating new study on set numbers for building muscle.